Okay, Rabbi say, today's Sunday, it's Beis Menachem. Yesterday I learned a Sikha from Tafshil Lamed Dalet, 1974. Those are the Sikhas that are coming out this year every Shabbos. The Fabrengen begins where the Rebbe said that the Pasuk says, V'hafachti evlam l'sosanefi. Simcha, the Eibush says, I'm going to change the Avelis into Simcha. The week before, last Shabbos, the Rebbe spoke a very interesting idea. That V'afachti Evlam L'Saseh doesn't mean that the Bein HaMetzorim pass, but that you bring Kedusha into the Bein HaMetzorim. This was a word that the Rebbe said. I spoke about it here, that the Eibush creates a narrowness. Mashiach doesn't mean that the narrowness goes away. Mashiach means that the narrowness is filled with life and light. In other words, after Mashiach comes, these 3 weeks will still be called Bein HaMetzorim, but they'll have a different reality. In the Meitzad, there'll be Oyer instead of Choshech, there'll be Gili instead of Helam. So the Rebbe says, we spoke last week about V'afafti Evlam L'Saseh. So the Rebbe says you have to immediately connect it to a Maisa B'Poyel. So the Rebbe said it's Shabbos. You can add in Yayin, and you can add in Basar, and add Simcha, and so on. And that year, 1974, was exactly the same as this year. Rosh Chodesh was Shabbos, Tisha B'Av was Sunday, same Kviyas. And the Rebbe adds, and wine, Yayin, is consistent with this theme. Why? Because what is wine? It's hidden inside the grapes. So the grapes, inside the grapes, the wine already exists, and you have to get them out. And that's Taka the Pshat. Nichnis Yayin Yotzo Soid, right? So Yayin is the Gematria Soid. Yayin, wine, is the same Gematria as secret. And in a different way, Shemen is also the same thing. What do Shemen and Yayin have in common? They're inside a fruit and you have to get them out. So the Rebbe said the idea is that the wine already exists. You have to just reveal it. So the Rebbe says, when it says in the Torah, V'afafti Evlam L'Simcha, L'Saseh, in the Torah, the Sasan already is. In the world, the Sasan is not yet. So you have to reveal it. And the perfect medium to bring about its revelation is Yayin, because Yayin is the same exact thing. This that is hidden has to be revealed. And the Rebbe says the most important thing is action. That's a piston. So the first message is, what you have to do is you have to eat meat and drink wine on Shabbos during the 9 days to through an action, be mahapach the evel l'sasan l'simcha, and then the Eibush will help that he'll finish what he needs to do. And then in the second sikha, which is a much shorter sikha, the Rebbe said, and you got to do mivtzoyim. 1974, Tafshil Lamed Dalet, was the year that the Rebbe made the next 4 mivtzoyim. Right, the Mivtza Tefillin, the Tefillin campaign started right before the 6-Day War, which of course I cannot remember. I was less than 2 years old. The other 4 Mivtzoyim he made right after the Yom Kippur War. The Yom Kippur War was from Yom Kippur till the end of Tishrei, till the beginning of Cheshvan. So during the subsequent months, the Rebbe made Mivtza Mezuzah, Mivtza Torah, Mivtza Tzedakah, and Mivtza Bayis Mali Sfarim Yavne V'Chachameha. And at the very end of the year, right before Rosh Hashanah, the Rebbe made Mivtza Neshek, Neder Shabbos Kedesh V'Yom Tov. So it's technically in 1974, but it's really the Mivtza of Lamed Hey, it's Neshek. And then in 1975, the Rebbe made the 2 other Mivtzoyim, Kashas Achil Shti and Taras HaMishpacha, the 3 Mivtzoyim connected to women. So the Hadlakas HaNeir, Kashrus, and Taras HaMishpacha, those 3 Mivtzoyim, for the most part, revolve around the year 1975, Tafshin Lamed Hey. And then the next year, the Rebbe made Avos Yisrael and Chinuch. But in any case, the Rebbe was very into the Mivtzoyim that summer. And of course, that's when the tank started, the tank. And the idea of a tank was not from the Rebbe, the Bachrim. The Bachrim used to rent trucks and go out into the streets of Manhattan and try to get people to do mitzvahs on the go. And the Bachrim named it tank. It was like the whole mood then. It was right after the war. And of course, in 1973, one of the most famous tank battles in the history of the world. So everything was about tanks. So the Bachrim called it a tank. And at one point the Rebbe adopted it and it became his. And the Rebbe said that the Rosh Hashanah of a tank is Tares, Nezikim, Kochim. Tares, Nezikim, Kochim. And but the Rebbe, the way he explained it, I'm sure there's more than one explanation, but I saw this in one of the sichos. First of all, you have to be metar the nezek. This that's not good, you have to make pure. And after that, you have to do That's how they touch it. Tara is nezikim. You have to be metar the nezek. The things that are not good, you have to make pure. And then the holiness comes after, subsequent. So that's a word from Divrei Harav. Let's learn Tanya. Okay, today's Tanya. Now, Rabbi said the last 2 weeks, we talked about Emunah. Why did we talk about Emunah? Because the Alter Rebbe is talking about Avim Esoteris, what we call the Pinteleyid. The Pinteleyid. Nekudas HaYahadus. We call it Yechidah Shebenefesh. In Tanya, it's called either Chochmah Shebenefesh, or it's called Avim Esoteris. And the Alter Rebbe gave us, in not a lot of words, he gave us a lot of information about how every single Jew, no matter who he is, Yimish Yemi Yisrael, has a nekuda of Kedusha from the Esesfidas Kedoshos, which includes Chochmah, and in the Chochmah there's Ein Seif, and that's why every single Jew has a pintele, has a point, which when it shows itself, it's connected to the Eibishter in an infinite way. Because Ein Seif is infinite. Chochmah is a kli for Ein Seif. And then the Rebbe moved on, so what are the symptoms of it? If every you has a Pintel Yid, what does the Pintel Yid look like when it's manifest, when it comes out? So the Alter Rebbe says 2 things. Number 1, Emunah. And we talked about Emunah for 2 Sundays. And number 2, Mesiras Nefesh. And Mesiras Nefesh al Kiddush Hashem, which we're going to be doing now. I have an itch to repeat one thing that I said about Emunah, which I think is very important. I'm repeating something. I'm repeating it because it's Viltzach. I don't know who I'm trying to convince, but I want to repeat it. And that is, the expression in English is a leap of faith. That terminology, a leap of faith, is very important. And I'll tell you why. Because not everybody is in the same level of intelligence. Some people are more intelligent, some people are less intelligent. Some people are what you would call bigger people, some people you would call smaller people. And based on that, our sense of the world and our sense of the place that we have in it and our sense of God changes. A more sophisticated person has a more complicated life. And by the way, complicated is not necessarily better. In fact, it's necessarily not better. Simple is so much better. But that's how the Eibishter operates. He didn't ask us what life we want to leave. He just gave us our ticket and said, play your hand. You can spend your whole life wishing you had somebody else's hand, or you could play the hand that you were dealt. If the Eibishter made you very complicated, right? What is the word they love to use in our culture? Very deep. So you experience pain, you feel frustration, you experience low self-esteem, you experience your own sense of inadequacy. But on the other hand, you can do so much, and you can live so rich. But one thing is constant, from the simplest person to the greatest person. Emunah is a leap. You gotta let go. You don't believe in Hashem because you have proof. You believe in Hashem because you've developed a relationship. And that relationship is letting go. However I came to the Eibishter, Rabbi Avinu came to the Eibishter through his moyach. We come to the Eibishter through our mother's milk. It's a much better way to go. We're born, Maminim, B'nei Maminim, believers, the descendants of believers. But the need to appreciate that Emunah is not a mathematical cheshbon. Emunah is not a worked out and calculated process. Perhaps there was a worked out and calculated process before. But Emunah means, I forgot all of that. Aribet, it's gone. Now I'm a maimin. Now I'm a maimin. Now I'm a believer. That's a very basic thing that you have to understand about Emunah. And as I explained it to you 2 classes ago, this is true not just of a Jew, it's true of a non-Jew. Human beings, Yidden and non-Yidden, have the capacity for Emunah. It's different levels of Emunah. There's different processes in Emunah. Hatzad Hashem, a person is not a believer because he's intellectually convinced that there is a God. A person is a believer is because he's let go of the considerations that brought him to this point, and he has a relationship with the Eibishter, which is a whole nother mitzvah altogether. Okay, this is what I wanted to repeat. So now we begin the next conversation. The next conversation is about the capacity, the concept of Mesiras Nefesh. So let's put it in these words. The second symptom of Ava Mesuteres, of Pintel Yid, that the Alter Rebbe chose to present to us in Tanya, is the idea of martyrdom, of sacrificing one's life for a higher cause. So we're going to begin to read. Okay? We're on page Chavdal Amar Aleph. That will mean page 47. The line that begins with the word Tamid. Now you got two Tamids in a row. You want the second Tamid. Okay, you have, it's 10 lines from the end of the Pedic. If you go backwards from the bottom of chapter 18 upwards, it's 10 lines. V'lachein, and for the same reason. Just like in the last two classes we spoke about Amunah, now we're going to talk about Mesiras Nefesh. Afilu kal shebekalim. The most lighthearted and conscience-free, right? The freest, the most frivolous Jew. Upaishe Yisrael, and Jewish people who are sinners, and people, including Jews who are sinners on a level that's called a Paisheya. Paisheya means a wanton sinner, right? You have a chet, and you have a avain, and you have a pesha. Chet means a sin done by mistake. Avain means a sin done on purpose. Pesha means a sin done in spite of tzaloches. So kal shebekalim, a Jew with no conscience. Upaishe Yisrael, and a Jew who sins, so to speak, to spite HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Meisrim nafsham al kedushas Hashem al aroiv. If push comes to shove, if they face a moment of truth, and it's a question of doing what needs to be done to sanctify the name of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, or saving one's life and being machalal and desecrating the name of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Alter Rebbe says all Jews, including what we call bad Jews, the worst Jews, sacrifice their lives to sanctify the name of HaKadosh Baruch Hu al haroiv, in most cases, which means that there's a miyat. The Alter Rebbe says there's a minority of people who wouldn't. But most Jews, no matter what the condition is, will be meisa nefesh al kiddush Hashem. Moreover, v'seiv liminuyim kosher, they're even prepared to experience and to suffer the worst kind of torture. Not to deny the unity of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And even though imheim burim v'yamei ha'aretz, they're empty people, they're simple people. Ve'ein yedim gedos Hashem, intellectually they understand very little. V'gam, moreover, b'ma'at sheyedim, even if they do know a little bit about HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Says the Rebbe, the phenomena of Mesiras Nefesh al Kiddush Hashem is ein mizbein im klal. They don't think about it. Ve'ein meisim nafsham, their sacrifice, their martyrdom does not come. Machmas das v'izbonenus b'Hashem, because of knowledge and contemplation of HaKadosh Baruch Hu klal. In other words, it's not a process. It's not a oizgerech and tezach. It's not thought through. It's an instinct. It's an impulse. I cannot cut off from HaKadosh Baruch Hu Ella, but rather believe shum das v'izbonenus, with no knowledge and no contemplation. When the moment of truth comes, they're meisa nefesh al kiddush Hashem. Rak ilu, it's only as if hu davar, this was a thing, she'iyef sheklal. It's just impossible. When a Jew is given a position where the Jew has to say to himself, I crossed this line, I'm not a Jew anymore. I crossed this line, I'm cut off from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, says the Alter Rebbe, he can't do it. Doesn't matter what he was, he can't do it. If he can tell himself, I'm still a Jew, like you have in Tanya Pedikut Gimel, he can do a lot of things. But if he has to cross a line where he has to say to himself, this is it, I crossed this line, I can't cross back over, he can't do it. Rak, it's as if, only Ki'ilu, it's as if, it's David, it's a thing, She'iyef Sheklal, as if it is no free will. Lichba by the Shemachad, to deny the unity of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, B'lishum tam v'taine u'mayne klal. There's no reason, there's no argument, there's no answer, it's an impulse. That when a Yid faces a moment of truth, he's meisa nefesh al kiddush Hashem. V'hainu mishum, what is the reason for this is? Shahashem echad, Hashem who was one, which is, we called Ein Seif before. Meir shines, u'mechayen gives life, kol ha-nefesh, the entire body and soul of this person, al yedei yislapshusa b'chinas chochma, by first entering into the person, in the seat which is called chochma, which we learned before 2 classes ago, which is beyond understanding. It's beyond knowledge and understanding that we can reach and we can understand. The Ein Seif, which rests in Chochmah, which is connected to Kedusha, which every Jew possesses as an inheritance of the Avis, compels a Yid to be Mesa Nefesh al Kiddush Hashem. Now, there was a Yid whose name was Dr. Zellickson, Ram Abba Haroif. He got married in 1951, Chanukah Tafshin Yud Beis. The Rebbe was Misad Kedushin, the Rebbe officiated in his wedding. By his wedding, the Rebbe spoke 2 long sichos, which were written down at the time. When Dr. Zellickson passed away in 1989, Tafshin Memtes, his son, Michal Zellickson, took these 2 sichos that the Rebbe said by his father's Kabbalah's Ponim. He prepared them, he annotated them, and he sent them into the Rebbe, and the Rebbe edited them. And he printed them in his father's biography, which you probably can't buy anymore. Told us Rabbi Michal was smart. As soon as his father passed away, he sat down, he wrote the book, he published it before he could lose his motivation. I bought it then. You probably can't buy it anymore. But in this Sefer, you have a Mugadik Sicha, an edited Sicha, which the Rebbe edited for the Sefer, and it's printed in Lekut Sichos and the Esofas of Chelik Lamed. Now you have to remember, when his father got married, it was still 51. It was 6 years after the war. The Kaller's Mishpacha, Rebbetzin Zellickson, Dr. Zellickson's wife, she did not come from a Lubavitcher background. She came from, I think, from a Germanic background, a Yekesha background. So obviously she came to the wedding with her family and her leadership. So the 2 Rabbonim from her Kehillah who sat at the head table beside the Rebbe, as the Rebbe officiated at the Kabbalah's Ponim. The custom was, by the way, that the Rebbe would come to the Kabbalah's Ponim and he would talk. After the Rebbe talked, the Chosn would go to the Badekin. And the Rebbe would not follow the Chosn. The Rebbe would stay in his seat. I don't know if the Rebbe stood up or didn't stand up, but the Chosn would go with the Mechutanim, that means with his father and his father-in-law, Dr. Zellickson, whoever took him to the Chuppah, and they would go to the Kale, and he would do the Badekin. Then the Rebbe, the Chosn, would go into a private room to put on the begodni, to put on for the chasana, the kittel, and all the other things you have to do to get ready for the chuppah. And then the chassan would go to the chuppah. After the chassan was under the canopy, that's when the Rebbe would walk out. Then the kala would come after the Rebbe was already there, and then they would make the 7 hakafas. What did the Rebbe do intermittently? What did the Rebbe do from the time the chassan got up to go to the badekin until the chassan was standing under the chuppah and they told the Rebbe the chassan is waiting, and then the Rebbe would go? He would speak a second sicha. This is all in the Sefer Makadesh Yisrael. So, but Dr. Zellickson's Kabbalah spoke 2 sichas, long ones. Anyway, during these sichas, the Rebbe spoke about Chanukah. It was Chanukah. And he spoke about the Mesidas Nefesh of the Chashmonaim. And he said in part that the Mesidas Nefesh of Chanukah has no basis in halacha whatsoever. It was completely beyond the parameters of halacha. Why? There's a lot of levels of Mesidas Nefesh. But one level of Mesidas Nefesh is not written in any book. You're not allowed to go to a place to endanger your life. If the danger comes to you, you have to deal with it as the halakha says. But you're not allowed to go to the danger. The Chashmonaim were hiding in the hills. They could have stayed there for years. They came down out of those hills to fight a guerrilla war. So they fought a nasty war. They fought a dirty war. A guerrilla war. In other words, they would attack and disappear in small groups. They bit at the hindquarters of the elephant, they got him angrier and angrier and angrier, and then they defeated him. But it was a certain death. The Chashmonaim knew that there was not enough of them. And the Eibishter made a nest, Sha'in Kamaisei, they defeated this great army, one of the greatest armies in the world at that time. So the Rebbe says, for a person who's hiding in the hills, and the hills are secure, they can't come up the hill for an extended period of time, to go out of that safety, to go out of that environment, to go out of that hub, and to engage in a war you cannot win is halachically not allowed. It's suicide. Why did the Chashmonaim do it? They didn't go to win. They went to make a statement that you're not going to desecrate what is holy, and we're going to watch. You'll kill us all, but we're not going to sit and watch you make a chilul Hashem. So the Rebbe argued this Mesidas Nefesh had no source in halacha, and the Chashmonaim did it, and Hashem made an S. So So when Hashem made a nes, the rabbis stroked their beards. One side of the rabbi is saying, excuse me, a bunch of Jews violated halacha. What, you're going to celebrate this? It was against Shulchan Aruch. And the other side of the rabbi's beard was saying that Eibishter made a nes sha'en kamayu. The story of Chanukah is an incredible miracle. Mamish. A tiny army, poorly equipped, and they were not trained, they were koyanim. Koyanim, they picked up a sword in their life. They were not Greeks. They didn't have an upbringing of sword fighting, and they were koyanim, they were priests. Their life was prayer and ritual and service and holiness. And they defeated this army. So you couldn't ignore the fact that Me'es Hashem Hoysezos. So the Gemara says it took a year. After a year, the Chacham said, no, this is a nes. And this nes adds a new halacha in Mesilas Nefesh. I don't know if the Rebbe said it in those words, but this is the spirit of it. When the Eibishter made the nes with the Chashmenoim, and the Chachamim said that this is reason to celebrate, they introduced a concept of Mesilas Nefesh, as the Rebbe puts it, without any cheshbonis. The Sefer HaChinuch says, the Sefer HaChinuch brings, that there are moments when a Gadol b'Yisrael, the example that he brings is Rabbi Akiva, just knows now is a time for martyrdom. It's not calculated. It doesn't go into the technical halachas. Are you allowed to die for this cause? Are you not allowed for this cause? A Gadol b'Yisrael has an authority because of who he is to say this is a moment. And of course that's the authority that the Frierdiker Rebbe had in Russia in the late teens and 20s to say this is a moment of Mesilas Nefesh. Anyway, so the Rebbe spoke about this by that Kabbalah's Panim. I'm repeating the Rebbe's words. I'm perhaps emphasizing a certain aspect of what the Rebbe said, but the Rebbe said this. When the Sikh was over, one of the two Rabbonim from Dr. Zellickson's wife's community said to the Rebbe, why is the Rebbe talking so much about Mesilas Nefesh? Which basically means about death. Now, I wasn't at that Kabbalah's Panim, so I do not know, and there's no video and there's no audio, they're just pictures. But I can imagine what was going through that Rav's mind. It's 5 years after the Holocaust. Really? Now we got to talk about this? Now? Yidden just lost literally 1 out of 3. I mean, it's just, our brain can't even fathom what this means. 6 million. Now you have to talk about Mesilas Nefesh. And the Rebbe answered him cryptically. The Rebbe said, quote, the Rebbe de Shver hat gesagt, als in Amerika darf man reden wegen Mesilas Nefesh. End quote. The Frierdiker Rebbe said that in America you have to talk about Mesilas Nefesh. What's the pshat in this mice? What does this mean? The Rebbe de Shver gesagt, the Frierdiker Rebbe said that in America you have to talk about Mesilas Nefesh. Of course, the first answer is, I don't know. The Rebbe can say whatever he wants. The Rebbe said you should talk. You talk. But the Emes says it says in Tanya. In chapter 25, we're holding 18. 25 is going to be Ich weiß nicht when. So we'll forget by then and we'll relearn it. In Perek Chaf Hei, the Alter Rebbe says, at the end of the Perek Chaf Hei, chapter 25 in Tanya, is really the Perek of Mesilas Nefesh. I've told this to you before, that when the Rebbe got married, the Rebbe's Gesund and our Rebbe got married, his father wrote him a letter, the Bleivik. And he writes to him, B'yei machasana, til me Tanya Perek Chaf Hei, B'kavona avoloi be'iyun. On the day of your wedding, learn Tanya chapter 25. Learn it with your heart and not with your mind. I'm translating it, yeah? B'kavona, with intent, but without examination. I'm not asking you to study it to do the scholarship. Feel it. Because Perek Chaf in Tanya is the Perek of Mesilas Nefesh. At the very end of the Perek, he says, and this is why, right? This is the Kriyas HaTorah of after Tisha B'Av, next Shabbos. Is Shabbos Nachmu is Voice Chanon, that the Pasuk says Shema Yisrael Havai Lekan Havai Echad. Or B'zeh we can understand that Hashem commanded Moshe Rabbeinu to tell the generation of Jews going into Eretz Yisrael the Inyan of Mesilas Nefesh. So the Alter Rebbe says, I don't understand. The Eibishter promises them, Pachtachem Meracham Hashem, that you're going to go into Eretz Yisrael, all the neighbors are going to fear you, and you're going to be incredibly strong and incredibly confident. You see, the greatest thing that you can have over your enemy is a fear factor. If your enemy is afraid of you, you don't even have to fight. The Eibishter promises Yidden that their neighbors are going to fear them. If the neighbors are going to fear them, they're not going to fight with them. If they're not going to fight them, so why are you talking about Mesilas Nefesh? So the Alter Rebbe says, don't you understand? When you can do Mesilas Nefesh, you don't got to talk about it. You only talk about Mesilas Nefesh when your circumstance doesn't require you to do it. If a Yid has to live Mesiras Nefesh, you don't have to talk about it, it's life. If a Yid lives like we live, in the Western world, where we're really not in a Maimed Matzah, we have to be Mesiras Nefesh, Kiddush Hashem, here you talk about it. Why? Why talk about something that's unrealistic? And of course, the answer that Rebbe is going to give in chapter 25 is you talk about Mesiras Nefesh to explain to yourself who you are. To explain to you, to me, what is a Jew? I'm ready for Mesiras Nefesh. My mother comes along with his Gewaldike Chedushim. I say, I'm stronger than you because of the Koyach HaMesiras Nefesh. You talk about it only when it's theoretical, you understand? When it's real, it's real. So the Alter Rebbe says this in Perek Chaf Hey. I'm mentioning this now. That here we have a discussion about Mesiras Nefesh of Kiddush Hashem. The Alter Rebbe's intent through the next 8 prakim is not to speak of Mesiras Nefesh like the Friedrich Rebbe spoke about Mesiras Nefesh, where unfortunately it was every breath. We're talking about Mesiras Nefesh as a tool for living. That when you remember the power of Mesiras Nefesh, it gives you the strength to live as a Jew. This is the trajectory. This is the direction. This is what's happening in this Perek. That's the first thing I wanted to say. Number one. Now goes number 2. I want to tell you a story. The story happened with me. I can actually go back in my notes, my cards, and I'll tell you exactly what day it was. It was the end of 92, I think. It was when Pekarski's Levaya, the Rosh Hashiva's Levaya. It was mamish before Rosh Hashanah. Medach was Nun Beis. Other Nun Beis, other Nun Gimel. Medach was Nun Beis. I had a very, very small group of students for Tanya that year. I was a young man, my second year as a teacher. And I had a small group of students. It was the very beginning of the school year. I must have been in Beis and Gimel, so it was my 3rd year as a teacher, I'm imagining. And I had 8 students in my class, or something like that. And one of my students was a troublemaker. You're talking a 10th grader. He had already been arrested for selling tefillin. He stole tefillin. He's a troublemaker. I don't know where he is today. This is almost 30 years ago. So I prayed every day that he doesn't come to school. Because if he came to class, it was impossible to teach. It was not possible to teach with him in the room. And he almost never came. That day he showed up. And we were learning this. I always started with my students. I started Perek Yitchas. I always started chapter 18. So it was a week or 2 into the school year. And we got to this point of Mesiras Nefesh. And I explained it. The idea that a Jew is read al Kiddush Hashem. So try to envisage a large classroom, a real official classroom, like in a public school. And he's sitting in the corner in the back, and the whole room is 8 boys. It wasn't 30 kids. It was a very small group. He gets out of his seat, and he starts running around. And he's talking out loud. But he's actually talking to what I was saying. He says, this is nuts. He said, I kissed the cross in a moment. And he was arguing with me. He was disturbed by what I said. He was disturbed by what I said. So I answered him. I don't remember how he responded to the answer, but I remember that it was a golden moment. We actually connected. How did I answer him? It was punked then in the papers. This was 1992. Yeah, a story that happened a few years earlier, in 1989. It was in the Kfar Chabad then. There was a famous story. I remember when the story happened, and if you're old enough, you could remember this also. That everybody knows that in Israel, after you finish your tour in the Israeli army, you backpack. You get your friends, and you travel the world on the cheap. A lot of them going out of South America. Some of them go even to Australia, but most of them go to the East. These places. And the tragedy, by the way, is a lot of them marry goyim and they stay. That it's not good. And Chabad picks them up. Chabad finds them in Mekom Galusim in Eretz Yisrael that never turn their head. And in Chutz Laretz, they don't know what to do for Chabad. A kid said 5 Israeli soldiers went to Indonesia, which is a Muslim country. It's the largest Muslim country in the world, 90 million Muslims. And they were arrested. And they were accused of being terrorists. And they put them in jail, and they were going to execute them. Didn't take much. They had Israeli passports, and they also had record that they were Israeli soldiers So they decided to accuse them of a crime. I mean, it was not true, but go argue. These were Taka Israeli soldiers, and they were not going to go down without a fight. So twice, they jumped their captors and escaped. It was a war. It was a fight. It was a fight to the death. Twice they jumped. Most of them didn't survive. 2 or 3 survived out of the 5 original, and they came back to Israel and told the story. And one of the details of the story, which was recorded in the newspaper at that time, was this: there was a frum boy. He probably wasn't a Chassidish Yid from Bnei Brak. I just can't imagine. He was a Mizrachist. He was a modern Orthodox boy, frum boy. And he had a friend who was one of the soldiers who was in that group who was actually killed, who was Shomer Hatzeit. He was a total atheist. And the entire tenure, the entire 2 or 3 years that they were together in the army, they argued about God. And it was an argument that went no place. Each one of them was bullheaded. The believer wasn't going to budge, and the non-believer was as much of a believer as the believer in his non-belief, and that's how it was. Then they traveled to Indonesia, and at some point during this entire event, someone came up with the bright idea that if they'll convert to Islam, they'll let them live. There's nothing new about that. That's part of our history. Someone came along with the suggestion that if they'll agree to become Rahman San Lihit Aslam, Rahman al-Islam, they doesn't let them. So this Shomer Hatzeit, this Jew who doesn't believe in God, shouts, "You're going to kill me before I do that." Now, he never got a chance to follow up on this conversation because he was actually killed al Kiddush Hashem. But he wrote in the paper, I read it in the paper, he said 2 years I argued with him and without a hesitation, boom. So I repeated the story to this boy, and it's eingestellt. The conversation was over. The point is, the thing that's interesting is, that when you're talking about Mesiras Nefesh, you're actually talking about something that you can't even explain to the person who does it. You can't even explain it to the person who's done it. You can't even to the person who's going to do it. Because the moment before you're a person, the moment after you're a person, at that moment you're not a person. You're infinite. So you can't imagine this being you. But when the Eibishter Chas v'Shalom gives a person a test, this koyach comes out. This is the second thing I wanted to share. 2 more things I'm going to say. In other words, the Lumdus we'll talk about next time in Mitzvah Hashem. Next Sunday there's not going to be a class, but the next time in Mitzvah Hashem. Hell, if the Eibishter wants there to be a class next Sunday, I just imagine that if next Sunday there's a class, there'll be other things going on. Maybe there won't be Bavatar on the Shir, but it'll be in a different Maimid Matzah. Not in a different place, but in a different Maimid Matzah, a different condition. This is a story that I heard from a very, very reliable source. I heard it from somebody, heard it from the Baal HaMaaseh. And since then it's been publicized in Gem. Gem has told over the story in what they call Faithful and Fortified. And the Yid's name is Levi, I don't know his first name. He's a very famous Israeli soldier who lost his arm during the Yom Kippur War. He was very, very involved in providing services for the soldiers in the various Israeli wars that were Rahman al-Islam hurt. And he met the Rebbe. There's of course the famous event when they met the Rebbe. The Rebbe came to speak to them. There's pictures of it. The Rebbe came downstairs and the Rebbe spoke to them. The Rebbe said such wonderful things to them. And the Rebbe went to each one of them. They were in wheelchairs. And the Rebbe, instead of them going over to the Rebbe walked to them. He shook each one's hand. He told them thank you, and he gave them $1. There's pictures. They walked from wheelchair to wheelchair. There was over 100 of them. He shook each one's hand, and he told them thank you for the Mesiras Nefesh, and he gave him $1. It's very moving. Anyway, this guy Levi was involved in that. I think he was one of the leaders of the group. He had a yechidus with the Rebbe. And this is a story he told. In Gem, you'll see the film. You'll see that it's edited. They took out certain parts because some of it is too controversial to publish. The Yom Kippur War was a war of extraordinary miracles, much bigger than the 6-day war. The tragedy was that we needed these miracles because it's our own preparedness that set up the need for such nisim and flies. Both on the northern front with Syria, 20 tanks stared down 200 or 300 tanks and won. Mamish, that's what happened in the Negev. And in the south, the Balev line was punctured, was gone. And the Egyptians had a clear road till Tel Aviv. I mean, the story is Piliploim. But this Levi had an outpost in the Sinai with 20 guys, a small little group. I don't know what the names of it is, a company, a chves. And they were given message by Arik Sharon that they're facing the entire Egyptian army. And there's nobody between them and Tel Aviv except them. So they have to stand and fight until they can't fight anymore. There's no retreating. There's nobody behind them. A group of, I don't know how many they were. Let's say they were not 20. Let's say they were 50. It was a small group facing an army. Thousands of soldiers with tanks and trucks and machines. And you said it's a mission of suicide. Soldiers do this every day. To save the group, the individual sacrifices his life. It's a well-trained army is like a body. You know, that every individual is not a person. He's a limb. He's part of a greater organism, and you have to save the organism. He says they're sitting in the desert, and he tells us, so he went into Yechidus. And he said to the Rebbe, Harabi min Lubavitch, Rebbe, may I ask you a question? And the Rebbe said, you can ask. So he told the Rebbe the story that I'm telling you now, that he was in the south of the Sinai, and they were told, Sharon called them and informed them that they're sitting ducks, there's nobody between them, besides for them and Tel Aviv, and they have to stand and fight and hold the army as long as they possibly could, so there should be a possibility of bringing up reinforcements, or whatever the plan of dealing with this total catastrophe were. He says, we're sitting in the desert, and we expect, it's an hour or two and we're done, finished. So there's doom and gloom. You can understand yourself, the mood. One of the group, Chevre was a Jew, a frumer. And he gets up and he makes a fiery speech. And he says, we're hated, not because we took Israel and because we built a state where Arabs think they live. It's because we're Jews. It's an ancient hatred. It's an irrational hatred. It's a super rational hatred. You cannot explain it. And it's as old as our people. He says, and we're still here because we fought the good fight. He says, let's fight. We all know the end. But let's go down like Jews. He made this very powerful speech and he raised the morale incredibly. Anyway, a couple hours later, the army bumped into them and they fought a firefight. They fought. And then the army retreated. The Egyptian army retreated. They stopped. Nobody knows why. One of the great miracles of they just stopped. When the Egyptian army retreated, they looked around to see what was left. The frum boy was dead. Says Levi, I lost my left arm. And he tells the Rebbe, when we were going into this battle, I swore that if I survive this battle, I'll put on film every day. So he says, Harabi Milabavich, can you explain to me why the one who rallied us from Mesiras Nefesh lost his life, and the one who committed to put on film can't because he doesn't have an arm? The Rebbe lowered his head at a trachtgetan. The Rebbe thought for a moment, and the Rebbe raised. The Rebbe used to speak to them in Hebrew, Ashkenazit, a good Hebrew, but with the Havora Ashkenazis. And the Rebbe said, Cain, I'll answer you. And he said to him like this. He says, that other boy, when he rallied you from Mesiras Nefesh al Kiddush Hashem, he aroused in himself the Yechidah Nefesh. He woke up in himself the Pintel Yid. And these are the words that I heard that the Rebbe said to him. The Eibishter decided to accept his korban. The Eibishter decided to accept his korban. And then the Rebbe continued. And you, the Eibishter wants you to know that he doesn't love you because of the mitzvahs that you do. The Eibishter wants you to know that he doesn't love you because of the mitzvahs that you do. And when you hear such a story, you realize that every day you should say, Shaloi Yasani Goy, Shaloi Yasani Ovet, Shaloi Yasani Rebbe. You don't have to answer such questions. That's the story. And one last thing I want to share, then I'll interrupt the shir. We'll talk about it next time in Mitzvah. And here's the problem. I have a recollection that I heard this from the Rebbe. In my mind, I heard it from the Rebbe. And I've looked for it multiple times. I went to look for it. I sort of remember what years it was. And I looked, I cannot find it. So I asked myself, did I imagine it? Or did the Rebbe actually say it, and either it fell through the cracks of the mafteches, or the Rebbe said it so quickly that it's almost hard to, I couldn't find it. I looked for it. So I'm telling it to you as something I heard from the Rebbe, but something that I'm doubting that I heard. The reason I say I heard it from the Rebbe, because I would never imagine it myself. I would never think this. The Rebbe quoted the Gemara. It's a very interesting Gemara. It's a very disturbing Gemara. There was a group of Jews named Tanya, Mishal, Vazari. Tanya, Mishal, Vazari were very prominent people. The Nebuchadnezzar made them into big machers along with Daniel. And then he threw them into a furnace. Why did he throw them into a furnace? Because Nebuchadnezzar made famously a tselem of dahava, of gold. The story, the book of Daniel revolves around this story very much. He already ruled the whole world, but he wanted to be a king forever. So he made this tselem to denote, to represent that his kingship is going to be forever, that Daniel has a dream. The head is gold, and the torso is bronze or silver, and the legs are bronze, and the feet are wood, that he wouldn't be king forever. Whatever, it's not important. The bottom line is, he made a law that everybody has to bow down to this tselem, to this completely golden likeness of himself. And they refused. And they threw them into a furnace, and their clothing burnt off, and they survived. Like Avraham Avinu. Avraham Avinu survived with his clothing. They survived without their clothing, but they came out alive from the furnace. A ness. So the Gemara says something very disturbing. The Gemara says, "Ilu nagdu lechanani mishol v'azad yeshua achas avapalcha letzalma." If instead of killing them, he had tortured them. If Nebuchadnezzar tortures them for an hour, they would acquiesce. They would bow down to the tzelem. Now, of course, there's a Tosfos. This Gemara is in a few places in Shas. Tosfos asks the question, how are you allowed to bow down to Avodah Zarah? Tosfos has a number of answers. One of the answers is that it wasn't even an Avodah Zarah. It was simply a statue of a person. But according to certain answers, it was Taka Avodah Zarah. And nevertheless, the Gemara testifies that they would not have been able to overcome the temptation, the pain. Now, why does the Gemara bring this? The Gemara brings this because the Gemara is trying to argue that torture is worse than death. The Gemara is the Gemara wants to argue that Malchus is worse than Mis. And they bring a raya from this, that torture is worse than death. Whatever the lumdis is, however the pilpul plays out, it's not important. But this is what the Gemara says. So the Rebbe said, I want to ask a kasha. We know the stories about the Anusim, about the Moranos, right? And then the Masai Satzlov about the Crusades. But the Rebbe spoke about the Anusim, the way I remember it. They were not prophets. They were not even from a Yidden. And they were tortured for months. And they would not accept Avodah Zarah. So the Rebbe says, the Gemara testifies about 3 Nevi'im, 3 prophets. Ilu Nagdul V'Chanani Mishol V'Azar Yeshol Achas Avapalcha L'Tam. They would torture these prophets of God for 1 hour. They would bow, they would give in. And we know historically people who were very, very far from prophets, who were tortured not for an hour but for months, for weeks and months, and they didn't give in. So this was the Rebbe's question. And the Rebbe answered the following, and this is part of what's going to be happening over the next class or 2, that there's different levels of Mesiras Nefesh. There's a Mesiras Nefesh that comes from strength, and the Mesiras Nefesh that comes from, for lack of words, from inevitability. The Mesiras Nefesh that comes from etzem. If a person gives away his life for a cause because he's so dedicated to his cause, no matter how dedicated he is to his cause, if the pain is too much, he gives in. That's called Mesiras Nefesh of Chaya. But if a person gives himself to a cause not because he's so dedicated, but as the Alter Rebbe says, the Lashon here, he can't cross that line. So then he's even prepared to suffer torture. And this is called Yechida. You see, there's a Mesiras Nefesh on the Reg of Chaya, and the Mesiras Nefesh on the Reg of Yechida. And the Rebbe explained that in the earlier generations, Jews had bigger neshamas, they had greater souls, they had greater minds, they had greater hearts, they had greater senses. The greater the conscious levels of the neshama were, the more distant was their yechida. The more hidden was their yechida. In later generations, the neshamas are lower and lower and lower still. When the neshamas get lower on the conscious levels, the yechida is closer to the surface. And therefore, when the times of the Beis HaMikdash was between the first and second Batei Mikdash, the neshamas of the Yidden were very, very great. So the Yechidah was so deeply hidden that the Gemara testifies 1 hour would have been too much. Today the Rebbe says the neshamas are much, much lower. But in a strange reverse, the less potent the lower levels of the neshama are, the more simple and absolute the Yechidah is. And this is what the Alter Rebbe says. I want you to see the words inside. I'm just going to show you this one line. He says, "V'soiv leminuyim koshem," right? V'lachein afilu kal shebekalon peish yisol meisin nafsha b'kedus Hashem alarei v'soiv leminuyim koshem. Not only are they prepared to be meisin nefesh al kiddush Hashem, they're prepared to suffer torture. Why does the Alter Rebbe add these words? Because in a certain aspect, torture is worse than death. And of course, the ultimate torture is to live in Soviet Russia, where it's chronic. It's not a day. It's an entire lifetime. From the moment you're born, for the whole Yemei Behem Shivim Shana, you're living Mesiras Nefesh chronically. You're looking over your shoulder every second. To live that way is a mentality of Mesiras Nefesh. In other words, it's the worst kind of torture because you don't even know where the torture is and when the torture is going to come and where it's going to come from. The Mesiras Nefesh that is needed to live an entire life under those conditions is a Yechidah Mesiras Nefesh, because it's not the pshat I'm so dedicated. I can't cut myself off. I guess I'll finish with one more story. What I did this morning was tell stories. We'll learn about it next week. When they came from Russia in the early 70s, the Rebbe sent a group of them to see the Moshe Feinstein. He was then at the head of the Agudas HaRabbanim. The Moshe Feinstein was a Russian Jew, mind you. And he lived through Stalin. He got out of Russia in the 30s, but the Moshe was a Rush Serid who was Mason Nefesh for Yiddishkeit. He was, in Russia, I'm sure he was very close to the Rabbeim and so on. The Moshe was met by 5 or 6 Chevre who came to see him. The Rebbe asked they should go see the Moshe Feinstein, and he told them that they should not be humble. They should let the Moshe know who they are. And he sent along Chadakov. And Chadakov introduced each one of them to the Moshe. And the Rebbe told Chadakov how to introduce them. One of them was introduced to the Moshe Feinstein as a Yid who's balking the whole Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch. And all of the Shailas and Tshuvas, Igreis Moshe. In Russland hat them geschickt Igre, Halacha Yid, this is Meshke Sades, they called the Katzenellenbayen. The famous Mumma Sades son. He lived in London later, the Meshke Sades. Anyway, the Moshe was overwhelmed. He was so delighted to meet them and to fabreng with them, and it was a beautiful, beautiful meeting. At the end of the meeting, he said to them, "Wie hat euch gehalten?" You didn't do this for a day or a week. It's forever. So, how did you last all of these years? Each one gave him a different teretz. One said the fabreng initially. One said the avas, the bruderschaft, the pashat avas Yisrael amongst the mishpacha of Hasidim. Another one said the hope of meeting the Rebbe. One of them, Jason Notik, Shmuel Notik, said, Moshe, Abreret Megat. Did we have a choice? And Moshe was not of his kalim from this. Because he didn't give a reason. He says, what do you mean? How did we do it? What else should we have done? That's the Taich, Efsher. You know the Breder. So the Rebbe says, from the Pintele Yid, from the Avim Esoteres, which is the way in Tzaf is Mislabish and Chochman. Every Yid has Chochman because every Yid has Kedusha, which in Yerushalayim Aviseinu, you have the Mesiras Nefesh al Kiddush Hashem. Okay, we'll stop. We'll make a break and we'll do Hayom Yom in Mitzvah Hashem.